Hello everybody.
Trademark. Hi everyone and welcome back to The Library is Open, darling. So I hope you brought your library card. Hello. That's 3 hellos now in 3 different ways, 2 of which I could well get sued for, but let's keep our fingers crossed that doesn't happen. Welcome to this week's episode. I would like to point out from the off, before he comments on it, I've worn this cardigan especially for John because I know it's one of his favourites and it's a little Starsky and Hutch moment. Okay, so we're back this week with a brand new novel to discuss at not too long a length, I hope. So let's jump straight in and introduce you to the book. The book. And here is this week's offering. It's a beautiful cover, isn't it? It's giving me massively 80s vibes, the cover, which is actually kind of a misnomer because a lot of the action doesn't really take place in the 80s. But it's a nice colour scheme nonetheless. So the book's called The Last of Her Kind, and it's by Sigrid Nunez. And I do apologise if I'm saying it incorrectly. I did Google around to try and find the correct pronunciation because I never want to offend anybody by mispronouncing their name. Not that she'll watch this. I mean, she might. Is she alive still? Yeah, she's still alive. But yeah, so this is the book, and it was published in... It was actually first published in 2006 in America, but it only received publication in the UK in 2009, last year, by Virago Press, who, interestingly enough, there's a little info page at the back, which I didn't know about this, but I'm really, really happy to know it. Virago was founded in 1973 as the first mass market publisher for 52% of the population, women, an exciting new imprint for both sexes in a changing world. And that's quite pertinent, really, when it comes to this novel. All the way through, I was sort of looking if I could find a quote or something that sort of roughly typifies the theme of the book, but it's quite difficult with this because it almost resists that. However, I think what I've chosen is quite illustrative. So there's a line here fairly near the end. "Nobody dies of love except in the movies" is a line from a very famous romantic French movie. Though I think, in fact, people die of love all the time, just very slowly. Which sounds very sort of grandiose, doesn't it? But actually, it really sort of ties in a lot of the seemingly disparate plot lines in this novel. So, quick overview of what it's about. Roll my sleeves up, so you know I mean business. And take a little slurp of tea. In time to spill the tea. Got a teaspoon here as well. It's nice, isn't it? It's from when I was a kid, this. And I always thought it was printed, especially for me, because it says, you probably can't tell because of the light, but it says Stuart on it, which I thought was amazing. Turns out that's just the branding. But hey, whatever. So The Last of Her Kind centres on 2 female protagonists, Anne and Georgette, also known as George, and they meet at college, Barnard, in Columbia, in 1968, at the sort of height of the rise of counterculture and opposition to the Vietnam War and so on and so forth. And they have a very sort of unlikely friendship in some ways because of how different they are. So Anne was brought up very wealthy, the daughter of a socialite and a businessman, and one of the earliest passages, when they become college roommates, the narrator, who's actually George, Anne admits to her that she asked for her as a roommate, not in name, but because she wanted to room with someone who was completely different from her, like her life experience was totally different anyway. So funnily enough, Georgette is from a working class family with more than its fair share of issues. You know, her mum's a single mother, not that that's an issue in and of itself. My mum was also a single mother, but basically a single income family, quite a few children, brother who ends up going into the army, a sister who suffers with mental health problems and becomes obsessed with Mick Jagger, and so on and so forth. So they sort of forge this unlikely friendship that's a little bit reluctant on George's part to begin with, but she really sort of comes to confide in and rely on Anne as it goes along. Now, Anne becomes very into politics and experiences a lot of guilt because of her upbringing, and also being white, and also being, you know, just generally privileged, basically. So she takes up the cause of anti-racism and anti-government control, and so on and so forth. And the two characters sort of drift apart because Georgette has a different sort of plan in place for her. And we see the whole novel predominantly from George's perspective as she reflects on her time with Anne. Anyway, fast forward, it goes through the years of their sort of slightly fractured friendship as Anne becomes more and more involved in politics and so on and so forth, and takes up with a guy called Kwame, who's an African-American school teacher. Anyway, they have a big fallout when Anne perceives that George is behaving disrespectfully to Kwame, which, you know, in the context of the book, I don't necessarily think she was, although we only have her word for that as the narrator. And they have a big fallout. She punched her in the face, and they fall out and don't speak. Next thing she finds out, Anne shot a police officer in what she claims is defence, because she was convinced that the police officer was going to shoot Kwame, and so she ends up going to prison. So that's sort of the main event. Oh, and the two sort of reconnect later on after a period of some years of estrangement. That's sort of what's going on. They're sort of like the protagonists, event to the backdrop of history. We've talked about this before. It's one of those novels where history is sort of going on in the background, and these sort of huge momentous events that are sort of contrasted with the experience of the people living through them. I think I was talking about this a few weeks ago, actually, to a friend, and I sort of said, it's so strange, isn't it? Because when you look back at historical novels or things set very much in a time that's important to the plot, because I do think it is very important and integral to the plot that it was set when it is, because a lot of what happens is a reaction either in favour of or against that. But if we look at the sort of contemporary political situation, I was saying, oh, in 30 years or so, we're going to be being invited into schools to talk about this time. But nobody knows they're part of history until afterwards, because you're just living your life, aren't you? It's only in retrospect that things take on the significance that they're going to have from future generations. I want to talk a little bit about the title of the novel. It's The Last of Her Kind, which, you know, on sort of prima facie is that it's about Anne. And there's certain passages in the book that support this, but it becomes a recurring motif throughout. When Anne's sentenced, for instance, in after the shooting, she's sentenced to 25 to life, I believe. And the judge says, the judge basically uses her as an example of everything that he hates about the counterculturists of that generation. And he says, I do not know who or what is responsible for the behaviour of young people like yourself, who start out in life with every promise, cherished by fine, decent parents, given every means to pursue good, productive, happy lives, and who end up throwing it all away, but God knows we've seen enough of you. I will lose no sleep over this, said the judge. May you serve as an example to others, and may you be the last of your kind. So there's very much a sort of generational conflict there which permeates the novel. I mean, a lot of what Anne says makes tons of sense. Does she always put the blame in the right place or at the feet of the people who truly deserve it? Possibly not. But it's not difficult to follow a train of thought and go, oh, okay, I get why you think that. Another another interesting part is they sort of contrast this with what's the book called? It's not Howard's End. It's another novel. Middlemarch by George Eliot. Sorry, my bad. Howard's End. Middlemarch. The prologue from that's brought up many times when George goes back to college years later to finish her degree. Both she and Anne have dropped out for very different reasons in the late 60s, early 70s. And she goes back to finish her bachelor's degree, specialising in, or rather majoring, that's what they say in America, isn't it, in English. And she's reading the prologue to Middlemarch, which features St. Teresa as a child. And they run away from their aristocratic home and go on a pilgrimage to Morocco because they want to live essentially as poor people live. And the sentence that resonates a lot with this novel is when George Eliot writes, "The Spanish woman who lived 300 years ago was certainly not the last of her kind." So it's not, I don't think, purely about Anne. It's more about a sort of weird chasm between the dying out of one generation and the arising of another, and how we make sense of that, and how we pay for the past, both political, social, and also personal in many ways. Is anyone ever the last of their kind? I don't know. So yeah, Anne, aside from the plotline with Anne, which sort of keeps intruding on George's life in one way or another, either literally through correspondence or through the way she views the past, because I think that's important. Yeah, I think this is a lot about the way we talk about the past and the way we view it. I've been writing a new first draft of a new project this week after Wake Up Maggie's all sort of done. I think I've mentioned this before, and I talk a lot about nostalgia in it. And I think one of the things I wrote yesterday, this may not make it to the final draft, but let's see. One of the things I wrote is that nostalgia is a kind of love, but it's also a kind of violence against the self. I think if you remember the song "Everybody's Free to Wear Sunscreen," I'll link that below. I'll link to that. There's a line in that which says nostalgia is, I'm paraphrasing here heavily, a better person would have written this on a piece of paper and read it, but I'm not. I haven't done that. God, it's cold. That says nostalgia is essentially a fallacy based on what we'd like events and people to have been, as opposed to what they actually are or were, which I think is really important, particularly in like contemporary political times when, you know, a lot of the moves that we're seeing with, you know, there's the Make America Great Again campaign, and, you know, to a lesser extent, or rather less explicitly said, there's that inference in British politics as well, and elsewhere. I mention those only because they're the most applicable to my situation. I'm aware that obviously politics worldwide is nuanced and different and matters just as much. Of course it does, just saying. And yeah, there's a sort of search for this kind of fabled glory days that are sepia toned and people by entirely happy people who had a great quality of life and never suffered. And I don't think they really exist, because, as I say, nostalgia can be violent and make you believe things that aren't real. You know, hindsight may be 20/20, but looking back is always rose-tinted. As it Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. It's philosophy. I'm trying to look for another couple. I bent some pages down because of the things I wanted to share with you in this video. This I love. So this is George talking about reading as a child, because when she starts doing her bachelor's degree, or rather restarts, she sort of reflects on what she read as a child and how this is sort of at odds with the perceived, you know, what's good for you to be reading. As you know, I've said on this channel before, I don't believe in that. I think just read whatever on earth you want. As long as you enjoy it, that's the beauty of reading, and it will do you good no matter what it is. I don't really believe in improving literature or anything, and I don't believe in reading under sufferance. So she says, except for the ones we brought home from school, there'd been no books in our house. In high school, when I grew hungry for more than what we'd been assigned, the books I brought home from the library were mostly popular books written for girls. Stories about cheerleaders and candy stripers and young equestrians. Stories that were almost always really about first love. I like the little details that have stayed with me from books I read as a child and of which I can recall little else. A bag of pretzels, a horse wearing a straw hat, an orphan's cardboard suitcase, patent leather bows on a dress, a dollop of cold gravy, a red wagon, red shoes, a lost cap, a boy ashamed of a mother who sliced and buttered her bread too thickly, a young woman surprised that a boy's lips could be so soft. I have a feeling that if I let myself go on like this, the list would be many pages. And then I think there was nothing wrong with the way I read as a child. Nothing at all. And I think that's kind of beautiful, isn't it, in a way, in the sense that we can often be made to feel ashamed or apologetic about what we enjoy, not only in reading but in culture generally. So I suppose the sort of what we describe as the guilty pleasure, whereas I would say no pleasures are guilty, providing they're legal, or if not legal, at least moral, or ethical. So yeah, so I thought that was really nice, really nice passage. There's some gruff is the wrong word. There's some heavy bits in this, and I think it has a lot to say about particularly the experiences of women in really like tumultuous political times. I mean, the period that's covered from 68 onwards in America, you know, massive social upheaval, massive changing of the old guard, massive attempts in name at least to make reparations for the past. There's one particular incident that struck me a lot where George describes how she's sexually assaulted in a park, and I'm not going to read you the whole thing. It's not especially graphic, but I am aware that people may not want to hear about that, so that is a sort of trigger warning if you don't, but I'm not going to read that bit. What I'm going to say is how Sigrid deals with it. She says, "I don't mean to be flippant, I'm just trying to find a way that I can tell about this." And then after the event, she says, "Nothing had changed. The same sun shone in the same sky. The river flowed darkly on, and a squirrel sat on a branch eating an acorn." And this was sort of pre what would become the Take Back the Night campaigns and the anti-sexual violence campaigns. But what struck me about this was how particularly when we talk about things like sexual assault or violence or, you know, these horrific things that happen, what's most, in my experience at least, what's most consistent or seemingly at odds with the event that's occurred is how things are not radically different. There's no sense of, oh, after this everything will be different, and the thing is that it's kind of not. It's what she sums up there in that line is, you know, the sun keeps shining, the animals keep looking for food, the world carries on as though it hadn't happened. This sort of major event that is not only always personal, and I do speak from personal experience, but also symptomatic of the wider society and the political ramifications of that. So I really I sort of blitzed through this. I think it was about, how long is it? It's 407 pages, but it's written sort of really compulsively. It's dense emotionally and reflectively, but it's not particularly dense text-wise. That's not a criticism. What I mean by that is it's incredibly readable. It's one of those where you just sort of go, and then you just sort of carry on. I like, for instance, to curl up on this little couch here with my cup of tea like this, sort of Hobbit-like. I'm very Hobbit-like, you should see my feet. And just turn the pages, and before I knew it, I was kind of at the end. So this is, I almost want to call it a fictional memoir of a time and a place that was so specific, but with, let's say, guest appearances from issues that will be evergreen. Yeah. It probably won't be to everyone's taste, because it is very sort of fast-paced and she doesn't linger, and the chronology of the novel is not sort of straightforward. It doesn't go from event to event to event. It works very like memory works in this novel, in the sense that George, as narrator, jumps around and changes perspectives a lot depending on how events or memories arise to her, which, as I say, is pretty much how memory works. Memory isn't linear. But I'm really glad to have read it, and it gave me lots of opportunities to treason, turn the pages down, or write little pencil marks on to remember to come back to them and have a think. So yeah, another great one. I mean, we haven't really had thus far a book that I'm not going to recommend. I'm sure that it'll happen at some point, but then again, it's kind of fairly inevitable, because I'm only really going to share with you things that I have strong opinions about and or like. So maybe that's not so weird. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. Once again, last of her kind, Sigrid Nunez. And that's the end of this week's episode in my lovely jumper. Check the schedule for what's coming up next. Do connect with me on social media. Twitter at Stuart Crowther, art in capitals, because that's how pretentious I was when I made the account. And on Instagram at Creeping Miasma. And if you want to follow the Vegan Queens, of which I am half, of course, then the link to that will be on my Instagram. All our socials, just search Vegan Queens UK. And of course, check out those vegan guys, my faves, linked below. Fabulous to see you here, as always. So from me, Starsky and Hutch, combined in one person, to you, keep those pages turning, keep your library card handy at all times, and I will see you next time. Bye.